The prophet Joseph Smith was often accused of criminal conduct. He was the defendant in a lot of cases that we'll talk about. The question for us to consider today is, was he guilty of any of them? Was Joseph Smith a convicted criminal defendant, or were all of these false charges, false arrests? And what does that mean? This particular musing is going to take us in a direction that I don't think anyone at the outset is going to anticipate it going in. So stick with me. To start, in section 24 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph documents here a revelation that he received about himself, which says in verse 8, "Be patient in afflictions, for thou shalt have many. But endure them, for lo, I am with thee even unto the end of days." Now, those afflictions were of various types, but they also included legal afflictions. One of the editors for the Joseph Smith papers said that they had found over 200 total lawsuits involving Joseph Smith. Now, involving means he was either a defendant or a plaintiff, if he was the one bringing a complaint, or also the judge. As mayor of Nauvoo, he served that role as well. The average for all of these court cases was around 14 per year, and so that's an average of one lawsuit per month during most of his ministry, which is kind of crazy to think about, that he was just constantly involved in litigation of some kind. Now, how many of those were criminal cases in which he was a defendant? I found some conflicting information on this, and I didn't have the time to do a deep dive and investigate every single one. If you go to the Joseph Smith Papers website, they claim that Joseph was a defendant in 21 criminal cases. Now, interestingly, there's this editor I mentioned with the Joseph Smith Papers. His name is Joseph Bentley. He's the chair of the Council for Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University. He claims that he's referring to a quote from Brigham Young, where Brigham Young said that Joseph had to defend himself in 48 criminal cases. And then Bentley, this editor of the Joseph Smith Papers, says, "We believe that this count of criminal cases against him is quite accurate." So, again, a little bit of conflicting information. Maybe it's 21 cases, maybe it's 48, maybe it's somewhere in, between there. Point is, whether it's 2 dozen or 4 dozen, Joseph is being named as defendant in a whole bunch of criminal cases. Let's walk through one example, and I'll give us a smattering of the others just to get a sense of what Joseph Smith is dealing with in a legal context as a criminal defendant, and whether he's guilty or not of any of these. Okay, so 2 months after Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, and after he organized the church and he's performed the first baptisms in upstate New York, he and Oliver Cowdery are in Pennsylvania. This is in June. And while they were at the Joseph Knight farm, they were preparing to baptize Emma and the whole Knight family, a bunch of other saints. About 50 vigilantes from town showed up, and they tore down the dam that they had put in place to create kind of a pool of water in which you could baptize people. And so these vigilantes destroyed the dam in an effort to prevent the baptisms. Well, the people there rebuilt the dam, and the ordinance was completed. They did the baptisms. But before the confirmations could happen, Joseph Smith gets arrested. And the constable who arrests him is part of this conspiracy that wanted to attack and do harm to Joseph Smith along the way going to court. But along the way, the constable gets so impressed by Joseph that rather than slowing down at the point in the path where the people were laying in wait to pounce and attack Joseph, rather than slow down as he was supposed to, this constable cracks the whip and gets the horses to run at a faster pace. They escape the mob that had kind of hidden behind the trees, and as they're pulling away from the mob, a wagon wheel falls off. So Joseph and the constable furiously try to fix the wagon wheel and get things back on track, barely escape out of there. There's a hot pursuit all the way into town where Joseph and the constable stay at the inn where the court would be held the next day. This isn't some lavish courthouse. This is just at the town inn. And the constable got Joseph up into an upper room, let Joseph take the bed. Constable sleeps on the floor with a loaded musket, with his feet propped up against the door to make sure that Joseph could get a little sleep. So this guy's clearly had a change of heart after interacting with Joseph. And a trial begins 10 a.m. the next morning. So now they're, at court in this inn. Joseph is the defendant, and he's facing charges of disorderly conduct. Now, Joseph Knight, the individual at whose home this arrest took place, he hires 2 non-LDS attorneys who were friendly They were farmers, neighbors of his that moonlit as attorneys as well, to help defend Joseph. Again, the charge was disorderly conduct. This time, in contrast to another court case I'll mention in a moment, the charges include setting the country in an uproar by preaching the Book of Mormon. Now, apparently that was, they were trying to claim that was against the law. Setting the country in an uproar. But hence the charge disorderly conduct was the charge. The case lasts 14 hours. They go until about midnight. 12 witnesses in total testify against Joseph, and several testified in his behalf. And in the end, Justice Chamberlain declared Joseph not guilty. At that point, he's immediately seized by some fiends from hell. That's the term given to it by Joseph's attorney. Again, non-LDS. He's not a Latter-day Saint. But he calls this new mob that comes in some fiends from hell, and they grab him along with a less sympathetic constable, and they throw him in this wagon. They drive 15 miles away to neighboring Colesville. He's given only bread and water for food. He's handcuffed to the constable who, is sleeping beside him in this bed and apparently yanking Joseph every time, Joseph is stirring in the night. So Joseph's now got very little sleep, very little food. Trial the next day, different town, 15 miles away, 10 a.m. once again. This case was tried before 3 justices, which is a silly term because these courts often don't render justice. It's silly that we call them that. But 3 justices of the peace on similar charges. And then they added the disorderly conduct of retrieving, quote, pretended angelic visitations and, quote, casting out a devil. So they're throwing all this stuff at Joseph to see if any of it sticks. This one wasn't a 14-hour trial, is an 18-hour trial. 30 to 40 witnesses testify against Joseph Smith. They go around the countryside just grabbing anyone who will say anything bad about him. Anyone who's got some kind of, any beef with Joseph Smith. Okay, so the trial goes all night, lasts until about 4 a.m. the next day. And, just like in the prior case, nothing is proven. There's no evidence. And according to the lawyers, Joseph is again acquitted of this case. Now, a mob had gathered outside the inn in anticipation of the ruling of the court, and or these justices. And, they were ready, as the mobs at the time were, especially with the Latter-day Saints, to administer their own justice, right? And so an attorney, one of the attorneys, and then the constable goes out front to meet with the mob and engage them, not in combat of any kind, just to have discussions with them, try and see what they're doing. Meanwhile, the other attorney lets Joseph and Oliver sneak out the rear window. The judge is copacetic with this. They slip out into the night. They flee into the woods. They run the entire 15 miles home. And, it's these allegations in court were in part what led Emma's parents, so Joseph's in-laws, to believe some of these lies and accusations. So when Emma leaves, when they leave Pennsylvania and go to the Whitmer farm in upstate New York, that's the last time that Emma sees her parents at all. Because despite the acquittals in court, despite Joseph being declared not guilty, they believe that he's still, a con man and a liar. They're believing what these allegations are claiming. So that's one snapshot of many other cases that Joseph is involved in as a criminal defendant. I'll give you a smattering of other examples as we then move on to discuss, well, what were the results of these cases? The one I just shared, he's not guilty, he's acquitted, but is that the case for every case in which he's a criminal defendant? And what's that other question I'm hinting that I'm going to get into later that few people are expecting me to go in this direction? All right, let's get through this sprinkling of cases. So in New York in 1826, this is a few years prior to all this 1830 kerfuffle I was just talking about, Joseph was charged with being, again, a disorderly person for his use of seer stones while he's working for Josiah Stoll. This is 1825, 1826, when Joseph is working for him. The cases were brought by a couple of Protestant ministers and other antagonists of the church trying to go after Joseph. So, claiming that they don't like what he's doing with this seer stone stuff. All right, there's another antagonist, this time in Ohio. This is Grandison Newell. He brought an assault and battery charge against Joseph Smith in 1835 for an altercation between Joseph and his brother-in-law, Calvin Stoddard. 2 years later, Newell alleged that Joseph Smith had hired 2 men to assassinate him. and made criminal allegations about that. Then, following some clashes between church members and opponents in Missouri, this is summer and fall of 1838. We all know this. Governor Boggs orders the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from the state and the imprisonment of Joseph and a few others on charges stemming from that conflict. So it wasn't just an expulsion or extermination order for the Saints generally. It was also, let's go after this Joseph guy, and we're going to charge him with criminal conduct arising from these violent clashes. April 1839, some grand juries indict Joseph and dozens of Latter-day Saints on charges of treason and several other crimes. Joseph's arrested in 1841, one of many times that he's arrested, but after appearing on a writ of habeas corpus, he was discharged on the grounds that the warrant was invalid. The following year, Missouri officials again seek Joseph's extradition, this time for allegedly being an accessory before the fact to the shooting of Governor Boggs. He goes into hiding, he's fleeing, he goes before the court again, a writ of habeas corpus to appear before the judge. Again, he's discharged on the merits of the case. So lots of stuff stemming from all of this going on in Missouri. May 1844, during the circuit court there in Hancock County, Illinois, a grand jury approved 2 indictments against Joseph Smith, one for adultery and fornication, and for perjury, based on testimony from former Latter-day Saints and critics. We'll get into this in just a moment. The Nauvoo Expositor, of course, the city council declares it a nuisance. Joseph, as his position as mayor of Nauvoo, declares martial law in response to the vigilantes who are now, agitating as well. Augustine Spencer, who's one of Joseph's critics, files a complaint before a justice of the peace alleging that Joseph had committed treason, which was an offense without bail. You couldn't post bail to get out of jail. This is what confines him to the Hancock County Jail. So again, all these cases, right? Disorderly conduct and a host of other charges where Joseph is either, acquitted or he evades capture, or the case is dismissed and all this kind of stuff. So is that true of every case? What were the results? Here's a quote I found from James Cullimore. He was a member of the 70s, back in the 70s when I found this quote. He says that the prophet Joseph was tried and tested and suffered many indignities. He was falsely arrested 42 times, but was always cleared by the land of the law. Okay, so here it's saying he was falsely arrested 42 times. If we go with Brigham Young's information about him being charged 48 times criminally, that kind of makes sense. If it's only 21 cases that are brought against him, that can still make sense because you can be arrested without charges being filed, right? The prosecutor has the discretion to determine if after your arrest, you're actually going to be, criminally charged. And so whether it's 21 criminal cases, 48, or somewhere between there, the point is Joseph is also getting arrested. And as Elder Cullimore at the time says, falsely arrested. But he says here that he was always cleared by the law of the land. He's getting this from a widely held belief, one that I had always kind of heard whenever this stuff was mentioned, that Joseph was innocent of every criminal charge brought against him, that it was all false arrests, it was all, bogus. That same editor of the Joseph Smith papers I mentioned earlier, he said, knowing that not once was Joseph found legally guilty of any charges against him has strengthened my own faith and regard for Joseph Smith, the man and the prophet. So he's affirming that he was innocent of every single case, and therefore that's a testament to him of Joseph's kind of prophetic role. A lot of the people who form this opinion and who have parroted this idea get it from Brigham, who said, I know for myself that Joseph Smith was the subject of 48 lawsuits, and the most of them I witnessed with my own eyes, but not one action could ever be made to bear against him. No law or constitutional right did he ever violate. He was innocent and virtuous. He kept the law of his country and lived above it. Out of 48 lawsuits, and I was with him in the most of them, not one charge could be substantiated against him. BYU Studies, they published a book called Sustaining the Law, Joseph Smith's Legal Encounters. I've got it right up there on my shelf. In that book, it says Joseph was never convicted of any criminal offense. Whenever he was given a fair hearing, he was found to be an upstanding and honest citizen. Now, for the most part, this is true. For almost the whole part, this is true. There was at least one case and maybe a second and maybe more that I think there's a little bit of disagreement about, where this kind of conclusive, declarative opinion that Joseph was innocent of all of them isn't really valid. So I'm not going to get into the particulars of it, but there was a skirmish between Joseph and a tax collector. They're driving by on a wagon. William Clayton's in the little carriage there with them. The tax collector's coming after Joseph. They get into a verbal skirmish. The tax collector calls Joseph a coward, and then there's some type of physical altercation. Apparently, the tax collector grabs a stone, allegedly in defense, because Joseph is, wanting to go choke him or punch him a couple times. In Joseph's own journal, 2 weeks after the event, it states that this tax collector had exercised more despotic power over the inhabitants of this city than any despot of the eastern country. He gave me some abusive language, took up a stone to throw at me. I seized him by the throat to choke him off. And William Clayton in his journal records that Joseph, they call this a little skirmish. So Joseph immediately, he doesn't evade this one. He knows he's guilty. He got involved in this thing. He immediately, or soon thereafter, goes over to Newell K. Whitney, who's the alderman in Nauvoo, and pleads guilty and pays a fine. So at least in one case, now if you're going to punch anyone's lights out, like a tax collector, I find it kind of funny that that's what who happened with Joseph. But that's one where Joseph immediately owned the consequences. He immediately kind of remedied the situation, at least legally. Of course, it's always a benefit when your friends are in charge of the government in Nauvoo and you have this kind of a theo-democratic system that you're building. But the point is that there was guilt in this case, and Joseph did pay a fine and plead guilty to that case. There's also a case with the Kirtland Safety Society. There were allegations of illegal banking. Joseph and Sidney Rigdon apparently were found guilty, from what I was able to read, and tried in absentia because they had already, got out of town, and then fined $1,000. So they weren't there in the courtroom, but this is another example where these people at least, and so maybe this is where you get to the quote where in the BYU Studies, the book that I mentioned, whenever Joseph was given a fair hearing, he was, found to be an upstanding and honest citizen. So maybe they're saying, oh, well, Joseph wasn't there to defend himself, and had he been, then the case would have been dismissed. And that could very well be true. Near the end of his life, Joseph said, and you've heard this quote before, "Deep water is what I am wont to swim in. It all has become a second nature to me." He then says, "As for the perils which I am called to pass through, they seem but a small thing to me, as the envy and wrath of man have been my common lot all the days of my life. It all has become a second nature to me, and I feel, like Paul, to glory in tribulation, for to this day has the God of my fathers delivered me out of them all." Okay, now, as we've established, and as you've probably heard being brought up in the church, and whenever we talk about these cases, oh, Joseph falsely arrested, we paint him as this victim of a mob-oriented, corrupt criminal justice system, and rightly so. Joseph is widely believed to have been innocent of basically all these trumped-up charges from other people, to the exclusion of the tax collector altercation and maybe the banking stuff that he wasn't there to defend himself in. And we champion this fact, right? We proclaim, like that 70 from the 70s, and like this editor from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, that this is an affirming thing about the prophetic role, that come what may, the devil's darts being thrown at Joseph, he's impervious to them, like Samuel the Lamanite up on the wall, come get me, bro, right? Like, God is with me, therefore who can be against me type of thing. And so that's the position that we take with Joseph and these criminal charges. We champion his innocence. We believe his innocence. We're glad he escaped custody. We're glad that he fled to other jurisdictions, that he's acquitted. And Joseph, in these cases, is asserting his innocence, whether he's evading or standing up in court or whatever. He's like, I'm not guilty of that, right? He's asserting his innocence, despite claims to the contrary, mind you, often from hostile or disaffected people. But he's asserting his innocence, and we believe him. But there's another circumstance. This is where I'm now going in this probably unexpected direction. There's another circumstance where Joseph maintained his innocence, and where those who say he's guilty, in other words, those who disbelieve his innocence, are not mobs comprised of critics, although they're part of it as well, but rather those who claim to revere him as a prophet. And I'm talking about polygamy. Over and over again, throughout his life, Joseph maintained his innocence about all these allegations being made about his involvement, his awareness, his teaching of it. And generally speaking, Latter-day Saints disbelieve that. We have come to believe in Joseph as lying for the Lord, as Brigham called it, trying to justify this practice, that, it was because Emma was upset, or, he had to for political reasons, or, whatever. We have all these excuses and justifications to buoy up the belief in our heads that Joseph was actually lying through his teeth, that this prophet, this elect called of God's servant, was nonetheless doing what God told him allegedly to do, but lying to everybody about it and being completely untruthful and so forth, right? So we'd come to believe, as part of this overall polygamy doctrine, that Joseph was lying because over and over again he asserted his innocence. Now, when I did a deep dive in this a year or whenever ago, when I was evaluating all the arguments here, and I've done a musing on this in the past, if you haven't heard it, I'm not going to get into all the different arguments and details in this particular musing. So if you're curious, you can go to sundaymusings.org, and then in the drop-down, just choose polygamy, and you'll find that previous one. So we're not going to get into everything. What I am going to get into here are some of the statements where Joseph and others around him are asserting innocence. Because if we believe Joseph in all of these other cases where hostile people, former disaffected members, and critics are all making allegations against Joseph, and we champion his innocence against all the naysayers, why do we not afford him that same presumption of innocence when it comes to this issue? So here's a few examples. Of course, we'll start with John Bennett, who's out womanizing everyone, telling them that, he'll perform abortions if any babies arise from all the shenanigans, claiming that Joseph has blessed this. So he's out there womanizing. Chauncey Higbee is following in his footsteps, seduces this girl, Sarah, tells him Joseph said we could. He just has to keep it secret because Emma would get mad if she knew. But he's, secretly said it's okay, and other people are doing it too. And so Sarah reluctantly starts to go along with it after she's being pressured into it. She later finds occasion to meet with Joseph. I think Emma was there as well, and decides to ask him straight up because she was so bothered by this. And he, denies that this is the case. He excommunicates Higbee after Sarah had kind of brought this up and said this is what's doing. And Joseph signs an affidavit saying Chauncey Higbee has slandered and defamed the character of the said Joseph Smith himself, and also the character of Emma Smith, his wife, in using their names the more readily to accomplish his purpose in seducing certain females. Then we go a few months later. This is in the Times and Seasons, October 1st, 1842. Joseph says in there, inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife, and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. We've given the above rule of marriage as the only one practiced in this church. Now, this was a kind of copy and paste of something that was in the Book of Commandments. In section 101 of what we now consider the Doctrine and Covenants was the law of the church, as it was called. It was written by Oliver Cowdery under the direction of Joseph, that declared and established the law of marriage. It was in section 101 in 1844, as Joseph is preparing kind of the updated version compilation of all the revelations that he's handpicking. It was to become section 109 there. It later gets removed when section 132 gets added, which totally upended the supposed law of the Lord to replace it with this, law of polygamy. I go into that other musing into section 132, and there's other sources which I'll point you to a little bit later if you're curious and this is new to you. Point is, Joseph here in 1842 is echoing himself and Oliver Cowdery and others from 7 years prior, and what all the saints are being taught in their scripture, in the Book of Commandments / Doctrine and Covenants, that the law of the Lord is one man, one woman, monogamy, right? And Joseph here is now publicly pushing this to the saints through their newspaper, saying people keep reproaching the church with the crime of fornication, the crime of polygamy. I am once again asserting, Joseph is here teaching, it's monogamy only. All right, so let's fast forward a year. We're now October 1843. Joseph said that he preached to a congregation to, quote, stop this spinning street yarn and talking about spiritual wives. I proclaim in the name of the Lord God that I will have nothing but virtue and integrity and uprightness. Spiritual wifery is just really another name for polygamy. It's claiming that kind of God has blessed these different unions, that even though it may not be the law of the land that you're getting multiple marriage licenses or whatever, that, God has blessed this polygamous type of relationship. So it's not a spiritual wife system in which you're, married to someone for eternity, but you don't have conjugal, marital, relations. No, spiritual wifery it's polygamy, right? It's we feel religiously justified in living polygamously. And so that's what Joseph here is attacking. He's saying, stop talking about spiritual wives. I'll have nothing but virtue and integrity and uprightness. Knock it off. We're not doing that. That's not a part of our doctrine. This is a few weeks later, about a month later, shortly before Thanksgiving. He brought charges, Joseph did, against Elder Harrison Sagers, accusing him of trying to seduce a young girl. This guy was already married. He had this young girl living with them, kind of helping out. And so Joseph brought charges against him, quote, for using my name in a blasphemous manner by saying that I tolerated such things in which he is guilty of lying. So as he's finding out about the Chauncey Higbees and about Harrison Sagers and others, that people are claiming that Joseph said this is okay, as he finds out about it, right, and as he has the mental bandwidth to deal with this, with all the, mobs and revelations and management of the church and so forth, he's putting this down. He's bringing charges. He's excommunicating. He's trying to fight this. Let's go 4 days later. This is at the Nauvoo City Council. Joseph gives an address, quote, tending to do away with every evil and exhorting them to practice virtue and holiness before the Lord. Told them that the church had not received any permission from me to commit fornication, adultery, or any corrupt action, but my every word and action has been to the contrary. Interesting. My every word, he says, and action has been to the contrary of all this stuff. He also said that I condemned such actions as John Bennett's in total, and warn the people present against committing such evils, for it will surely bring a curse upon any person who commits such deeds. All right, a few months later, Joseph and Hiram, now posting this in the Times and Seasons, again, the church's newspaper, February 1st, 1844, says, as we have lately been credibly informed that an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by the name of Hiram Brown has been preaching polygamy and other false and corrupt doctrines in the county of Lapeer, state of Michigan. This is to notify him and the church in general that he has been cut off from the church for his iniquity. And he is further notified to appear at the special conference on the 6th of April next to make answer to these charges. So again, they find out that someone's out there teaching about polygamy and saying that Joseph said it's okay and this is what the Lord wants, and spiritual wifery. And, there have been a few, a sect, at least one I'm familiar with. I think there was another one where spiritual wifery was practiced, and the Mormons go in there and baptize a lot of those people. So they're coming into, the Mormon church, and they got these kind of conceptions and beliefs and practices that they're kind of bringing over. So Joseph and Hiram here putting it down. Hiram standing alongside Joseph for a lot of this, as was Emma, trying to just push back against this whack-a-mole every time they found out about this, fighting it and declaring innocence. And innocence was the name of the next thing we'll talk about. 1844, polygamy rumors are swirling around Nauvoo. And so Joseph holds court in the mansion house against a gentleman named Orsimus Bostwick on charges of slander against Hiram and certain females in Nauvoo. And so there was claims, again, these polygamous claims, oh, Joseph's doing this, Hiram's doing this, they're doing it in secret, Emma doesn't want to know, Joseph taught me, it's okay, come to bed with me, second wife, right? There's a lot of this just behind the scenes bubbling up, that a lot of it, apparently Joseph and Hiram aren't aware of the full extent of it, but they're dealing with it as it comes to their attention, and they start finding out about it, including holding court against this Bostwick guy, saying that it's slanderous that he's claiming this about Hiram. Again, defending, asserting innocence here against these allegations of polygamous and adulterous type conduct. So Joseph then goes to W.W. Phelps and asks him to write a declaration that just decimates plural marriage, stronger than what's been said before. Right before, they've got the thing from Doctrine and Covenants 101/109, the law of the Lord. Hey, one man but one wife. Joseph's been out talking about it, repeatedly saying, knock it off, excommunicating, bringing charges, etc., etc. He goes to Phelps and he says, we need something strong. Will you put something together? This becomes known as the Voice of Innocence, this document. And March 7th, so this is just a month after Joseph and Hiram published that last piece in the Times and Seasons, March 7th, there's a huge assembly at the temple, and this Voice of Innocence document was read. The entire congregation says amen twice. Everyone's buying into this thing, a portion of which reads, Many of the distinguished females of Nauvoo have waded to their present habitations through persecution, sorrow, and death, robbed and insulted and bereaved of husbands and children by the combined powers of priests and spiritual wickedness in high places. But none of these piercing calamities of man touched the heart of woman with such severe poignancy as the envenomed slander of O.F. Bostwick, this is the guy we were just talking about, that, quote, he could take a half bushel of meal, obtain his vile purposes, and get what accommodation he wanted with almost any woman in the city. So this guy is claiming that if he, fed a woman, that people were so needy that he could, womanize anyone and take care of them a little bit, offer them something in exchange, and basically, prostitute the women of Nauvoo. The document then continues a little bit later, resolved unanimously that while we render credence to the doctrines of Paul, that neither the man is without the woman, neither is woman without the man in the Lord, yet we raise our voices and hands against John Bennett's spiritual wife system as a scheme of profligates to seduce women, and they that harp upon it wish to make it popular for the convenience of their own cupidity. Wherefore, while the marriage bed, undefiled, is honorable, let polygamy, bigamy, fornication, adultery, and prostitution be frowned out of the hearts of honest men to drop in the gulf of fallen nature, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, and let all the saints say amen. So this is when they get the double amen from the crowd that's present. With all these rumors swirling around, people are starting to hear, wait, there's, what's this polygamy stuff? Am I going to have to do this? Word is starting to kind of spread, and everyone's claiming, those who are whispering about it, that Joseph is the mastermind behind it all. And yet, to the extent Joseph is learning any of this from established evidence that we can find, in every case, Joseph is fighting against it and trying to stop it, saying that's not the case. They take this document, Voice of Innocence, they read it in 4 overflowing Relief Society meetings. They had to hold multiple meetings to fit everybody and let them all hear it. Unanimous adoption in all of these meetings. So this document basically is just kind of the antidote or the counter agent to all these rumors spreading around about polygamy. So that was March 7th, and then in the days following for the Relief Society meetings. Well, March 8th, some saints, or one Latter-day Saint, shows up from Hancock County, representing, being kind of an emissary from multiple other Latter-day Saints in Hancock County who had been hearing about this polygamy stuff. So the grapevine is extending over across great distances, and they're like, what is going on? What is this? They send an emissary to Nauvoo to ask about it. Hiram writes a letter answering some of their questions, prints it in the Times and Seasons to broadcast it more widely as another opportunity to say, knock it off. This isn't what we're teaching. This isn't what we're doing. Here's what the answer says. To the brethren of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, living on China Creek in Hancock County, greeting. Whereas Brother Richard Hewitt has called on me today to know my views concerning some doctrines that are preached in your place, and states to me that some of your elders say that a man, having a certain priesthood, may have as many wives as he pleases, and that doctrine is taught here, I say unto you that that man teaches false doctrine, for there is no such doctrine taught here, neither is there any such thing practiced here. And any man that is found teaching privately or publicly any such doctrine is culpable and will stand a chance to be brought before the high council, and lose his license and membership also. Therefore he had better beware what he is about. And just another month later, another article in the Times and Seasons publishing a letter to the elders abroad, so the missionaries who are out gallivanting around the countryside. In this article in the Times and Seasons, Joseph and others expressing their dismay that, quote, any elder or priest who has been in Nauvoo and has had an opportunity of hearing the principles of truth advanced should for one moment give credence to the idea that anything like iniquity is practiced, much less taught or sanctioned, by the authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Fast forward a few weeks, we're now 1 month prior to Joseph's death, and he gives a powerful speech and hones in on this issue and says, among other things, for the last 3 years, I have a record of all my acts and proceedings, for I have kept several good, faithful, and efficient clerks in constant employ. They've accompanied me everywhere and carefully kept my history, and they've written down what I have done, where I have been, and what I have said. Therefore my enemies cannot charge me with any day, time, or place but what I have written testimony to prove my actions, and my enemies cannot prove anything against me. I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. I mean to live and proclaim the truth as long as I can. This new holy prophet," he's referring to William Law, "has gone to Carthage and swore that I told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifism, why, a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this." So he's now publicly, again, defending himself in this lecture, in this speech, against this constant rumor that's been bubbling up, as he says, even from the earliest days of his ministry and marriage. He continues, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can find only one. I am the same man, and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. I labored with these apostates myself until I was out of all manner of patience, and then I sent my brother Hiram, whom they virtually kicked out of doors." Okay, so again and again and again and again, Joseph is asserting innocence. He's fighting those who are claiming in his name. He's saying it's slander. He's excommunicating, bringing charges against them. To the extent that we know Joseph was made aware of these things, he is responding publicly and privately in opposition to the practice and the teaching of polygamy. Years later, Emma Smith is interviewed by her son, Joseph Smith III, so Joseph Smith's son. And Joseph Smith III had heard his mom on many occasions say that, Joseph was never a polygamist, that this was an invention of Brigham and others who tried to pin it on Joseph to justify the practice and claim that they came from Joseph and so forth. She had long said this, and so Joseph Smith III decided to get it documented. So he interviews his mom in kind of a question and answer format. Question: what about the revelation on polygamy? Did Joseph Smith have anything like it? What of spiritual wifery? Answer: there was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. There were some rumors of something of the sort, of which I asked my husband. He assured me that all there was of it was that in a chat about plural wives, he had said, well, such a system might possibly be if everyone was agreed to it and would behave as they should, but they would not. And besides, it was contrary to the will of heaven. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught publicly or privately by him, Joseph, before my husband's death, that I have now or ever had any knowledge of. Question: did he not have other wives than yourself? Answer: he had no other wife but me, nor did he, to my knowledge, ever have. Question: did he not hold marital relation with women other than yourself? Answer: he did not have improper relations with any woman that ever came to my knowledge. Question: was there nothing about spiritual wives that you recollect? Answer: at one time my husband came to me and asked me if I had heard certain rumors about spiritual marriages or anything of the kind, and assured me that if I had, that they were without foundation, that there was no such doctrine, and never should be with his knowledge or consent. I know that he had no other wife or wives than myself, in any sense, either spiritual or otherwise. So what we're dealing with here is that somebody is lying. Either Joseph is lying or Brigham and Heber and others are lying, because somebody is not telling the truth. And so the question is, why do we assume Joseph was the one lying? Why do we assume that he is the one who was not telling the truth? Just because others later claimed that that was the case, others who had a vested interest in the practice and wanted to justify it? Why is it that we automatically presume that despite his many denials, public and private, that Joseph was in fact guilty? We champion his innocence in all the other cases I mentioned, all these criminal cases. Yay! It's affirming, it's faith affirming that Joseph, was innocent of all these things that he maintained his innocence in, and I believe him, and I'm glad he was never found to be guilty. And yet the Latter-day Saints generally convict him with guilt of the practice of polygamy, despite his protestations to the contrary, despite his affirming his innocence. So we got Joseph, on the one hand, who is receiving regular divine manifestations, clearly is a prophet, seer, and revelator. There's fruit of evidence of that. Numerous angelic visitations, communing with God face to face. Here's this chosen prophet to restore the gospel to the earth, right? So on the one hand, we got this guy. On the other hand, we got Brigham. Brigham, 1859, saying, have I yet lived to the state of perfection that I can commune with the Father and the Son at my will and pleasure? No. A few years later, perhaps when I'm 80 years of age, I may be able to talk with some being of a higher sphere than this. So repeatedly, Brigham is basically saying that to him, the heavens are closed. This is the guy who, I believe, introduces polygamy as a doctrine, who bans black people from the priesthood, who does the Mountain Meadows massacre and blood atonement and all this stuff, right? The Adam God doctrine, all these four major things that are now kind of repealed and repudiated. And so I look at the two of them and I say, okay, I have to evaluate between these two claims. Joseph is saying he didn't do it, and then Brigham later on, after Joseph's death, when he's no longer there to, defend himself, is claiming that, oh, Joseph privately told me, just like, John Bennett and Chauncey Higby and all these people were all claiming that Joseph was telling them in secret, despite the fact that Joseph was always excommunicating and, bringing charges against them. So what question, if we're on a jury, so imagine you're on a jury where these charges are brought. Joseph Smith is a defendant in the case of being charged with polygamy, and you're a juror, you've been selected from the jury pool, you're sitting there listening to the evidence. What evidence does the prosecution have to support the claim that Joseph Smith, in fact, taught and practiced polygamy? Well, there's no posterity. There's no evidence of him siring any children at all. There's no contemporary evidence prior to his death. In fact, the contemporary evidence all shows him in public and private denying it, punishing those who are claiming that he's teaching it, punishing those, excommunicating those who are practicing it, right? But there's no evidence on the prosecution side of Joseph. I should say no contemporary evidence. The so-called evidence that exists to support the prosecution's viewpoint that Joseph was a polygamist, taught it and practiced it, comes years and mostly decades later from people who are themselves polygamists, claiming that Joseph originated it, coming up with affidavits years and years and years later, saying that Joseph sanctioned the entire thing, when they are now part of this system that here is the order of things, and so you got to go along with this, and we've all been brought up to believe this because our prophet Brigham and everyone else has said it was from Joseph, so we believe them, and therefore it came from Joseph. And then you get, people creating memories. Oh, yeah, I remember Joseph said this, and I remember, these affidavits are unreliable. They're years and years and years later. And further, as I said in that other musing that I did, I think what was really going on here, as I understand it, is that Joseph was going around sealing himself to people in an eternal, spiritual-only sense. He had this grandiose idea, as did the saints, right? When Joseph dies, you get all these saints going to the temple and baptizing and sealing themselves to Joseph, later sealing themselves to Brigham. The idea that Joseph, as I see it, early on was working with was that he was trying to seal all of humanity in this very magnanimous heavenly vision. And so Joseph is going around doing this, right? And people are misinterpreting that, and they're hearing, oh, wait, Joseph, did this with this girl or did that with that woman, and he's doing it with all kinds of people, but there's no evidence of any sexual conduct, any conjugal visits, any children, any of that kind of stuff. And so I think there was just this massive misinterpretation and confusion, and combine that with all the spiritual wifery stuff that was going on, there were a lot of people who didn't really see any difference between the two, and therefore thought that Joseph, in doing these sealings, was really doing spiritual wifery, and thus sanctioning it, therefore we can do it too. And then things just kind of spread from there. So no evidence, really, that the prosecution has, no contemporary evidence that I've been able to encounter that really demonstrates or refutes Joseph's, maintaining of his own innocence. In fact, as you consider yourself on a jury, right, if you're in court, you get prosecution and defense who are able to each make their arguments. So I'm going to link in the comments on the YouTube video. If you're listening to the podcast, if you're on Facebook or whatever, head over to look me up on YouTube. You'll find the video. And in the comments, I'll post 2 videos that were on a channel called Hemlock, where they got 2 people to speak in favor of Joseph being a polygamist, and then 2 people against. I would encourage you to watch both. They're very long, so, find some time and evaluate the claims on both sides, where these people are trying to throw every argument, rebuttal, and go let the 2 sides offer their best evidence and arguments so that you can be that juror, right? But if I'm on the jury, if I'm having to evaluate whether the prosecution's proposal is valid, whether Joseph was a polygamist or not, then I think that Joseph deserves the presumption of innocence until he's proven guilty, especially if he's asserting his innocence. If someone, comes in and just says, I did it, I plead guilty, then of course you don't need to presume their innocence. They pled guilt. But Joseph, during his lifetime, is maintaining his innocence. Therefore, I believe he's entitled to presumption of innocence. And that if we're convicting him in a church council or a criminal court, let's try and prove the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the question. As you evaluate both sides, as you dig into this, as you watch those other videos if you want, there's other resources. You can, Michelle Stone has her 132 Problems podcast, which has a lot of great, videos on that, especially the recent ones on William Clayton, on whom this entire thing hangs. So you can go look up 132 Problems, William Clayton. You'll find those videos with Jeremy Hoop. That was really fascinating. Another resource I found helpful is this book called Joseph Smith Revealed, A Faithful Telling, the self-published book by a woman named Whitney Horning, which is a good effort to try and summarize a lot of the pro-Joseph monogamist viewpoint that, frankly, growing up in the church, I had never really come across. I was just taught, he was a polygamist, and he was lying, and he was going around doing all this stuff, and an angel with a sword commanded, like all these things, right? These kind of mythical tales that had just been built up. And so that book was kind of a helpful glimpse into just compiling a lot of the arguments and quotes and so forth that allow Joseph to kind of advocate or give voice to that innocence that he was asserting. So the question is, can the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joseph was a polygamist? We can't admit hearsay as evidence. These affidavits decades later don't work. There's no contemporary evidence. There's no children. As I think about this, if I'm having to decide on this as a juror in court, I don't see how I can convict Joseph of guilt. Now, juries all the time in court say someone is not guilty when, in fact, they are. They just had a good lawyer and the evidence was weak or, things like that. So, as I said in that other podcast, I leave the door open for Joseph, in fact, doing this despite his protestations, despite asserting his innocence. I'm comfortable with the potentiality of that, although I don't believe that's the case at all. And as I review the evidence and the people involved, like William Clayton and Brigham Young and others, and they're going around editing journals and editing history to shape the new narrative of things, and William Clayton is out in, England, fooling around with a woman that's not his wife long before any of this. And anyways, there's all kinds of rabbit holes and interesting information that you can find now to go into this. My point here is not to get in depth into a lot of the arguments, just to point out that I think there's an inconsistency. We look at all those other criminal charges and we say, Joseph was innocent. He declared his innocence. I believe him. And he was acquitted, and how great. And then we have, on the other hand, Joseph's declaring his innocence about all this polygamy stuff. He died before any, formal inquiry or anything more significant could have happened other than what he was trying to do. And so now we're just believing people who themselves decided to jump on the polygamy train and wanted to throw it all on Joseph in order to substantiate the divine approval of the practice. And I just don't see sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But he may still actually have been involved in some of this stuff. But there's no evidence that allows me to conclude that, in light of the fact that he was asserting his innocence, that all the people, all the so-called evidence saying that he did it comes years later, comes from his detractors, comes from John Bennett, and the Laws and the Higbees and all these antagonists that, in order to agree with the Joseph polygamy narrative, we have to believe his critics. We don't believe his critics with all those other court cases. They were all wrong in that case. But suddenly, when we're talking about Joseph's polygamy, we're believing his critics. We're believing the people that he's excommunicating. We're believing the disgruntled people who are alleging and claiming things. So why that inconsistency? I find that very incongruous between the two. When he first visited Joseph, the angel Moroni told him, and we all know this, that his name should be had for good and evil among all nations. And with the scriptures just totally declaring that polygamy is evil, I think you can make the argument that many Latter-day Saints, in saying that Joseph was effectively a liar, that he was doing this in private, that claiming that his claims of innocence were all just deceptions and lies, that you can make the argument that these Latter-day Saints who hold this opinion are holding Joseph's name for evil, in a sense. We use this quote to say, oh, all those people who aren't members of our church are criticizing us or saying that Joseph was a fraud or a charlatan or whatever. But I find it interesting that we Latter-day Saints, if we buy this narrative, it requires us to believe that Joseph was up to no good. And I don't really believe that. I don't think there's evidence to substantiate that. There's a lot of myth, there's a lot of claims, there's a lot of affidavits decades later, there's a lot of narrative to support the kind of polygamous direction that Brigham really leaned into, but there's not evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, right? If we see a headline in the news or on social media or whatever, we shouldn't just automatically assume, like imagine a case about someone who did something horrible, right? We shouldn't automatically assume guilt. That's convicting them in the court of public opinion. There's some slanted headline, limited, information news story, and we just believe that person's guilty. That's wrong. Especially, we shouldn't do that when it comes to serious charges and their implications. We should study and review the claims. We should evaluate the evidence. And so I would encourage you to do that. It doesn't have to be that book. It doesn't have to be these YouTube links that I'm going to post. But there's a lot of information out there, and I think it's worth it, especially for something as important as this, to give Joseph the benefit of the doubt, presume his innocence, and see if there is sufficient evidence that could be admitted in court that is valid evidence in order to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joseph, in fact, was doing this. I don't think we should listen to his enemies, just as we didn't listen to his enemies in all these other criminal court cases. I don't think we should believe the Bennetts and the Laws and the Higbees and others who wanted to tear Joseph down and who themselves were guilty of the very things they were claiming Joseph was doing. I think we should believe Joseph, unless and until we can find contemporary evidence to substantiate the claims of his critics. I haven't found that. I've been looking into it. This is not a case closed for me. So if you've got other ideas and evidence, I welcome that. It's something I continue to study. Just thinking the other day that it's kind of silly that whenever we talk about all of his legal troubles, we say, Joseph was the prophet, he was innocent, none of these charges stuck, so great. But then we don't do that in this case, and I just find that a little inconsistent. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, especially on YouTube. I'm posting a little bit more YouTube optimized. So if you're watching on Facebook or you're listening on the podcast, head over and subscribe on YouTube. That way you don't miss anything. And we'll see you next week.